Sheriff Lucas Morgan was just settling into his recliner, a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and the TV remote in the other, when the aggressive knocking at his front door shattered his peaceful morning. He wasn't expecting visitors, especially not the kind who pounded like they were trying to break in. With a sigh, he set his coffee down and walked to the door. The sight that greeted him nearly made him laugh out loud. 3 men in ill-fitting uniforms stood on his porch, chests puffed out like they were about to raid a criminal hideout. The tallest one, a middle-aged guy with a thick mustache and mirrored sunglasses, took a step forward, flashing a shiny badge that looked more like it came from a toy store than an official department. "Sir," the mustache man said in a deep, authoritative voice, "we need you to step outside immediately." Lucas raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms over his chest. "And who might you be?" "We're with the HOA enforcement unit," the man announced, his 2 lackeys nodding seriously behind him. "You violated multiple neighborhood ordinances, and we're here to bring you in." Lucas stared at them for a long moment, trying to decide if they were joking or just incredibly stupid. "The HOA has an enforcement unit now?" he asked, playing along. "We do," the mustache man said, lifting his chin. "And we don't tolerate noncompliance." The absurdity of the situation was almost too much. Lucas knew his HOA had always been a little overzealous, but this was next-level nonsense. The mustached man reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, dramatically flipping it open. "You have been cited for an unapproved mailbox design," he said, his voice full of artificial authority, "and unauthorized lawn furniture." Lucas blinked. "My mailbox?" He glanced over at the standard black mailbox, standing at the edge of his driveway. "What's wrong with it?" "It doesn't conform to the HOA's latest aesthetic guidelines," one of the lackeys chimed in, looking down at his own clipboard as if reading from a script. "Section 4, subsection B, line 12. And my lawn furniture?" Lucas continued, motioning to his porch where 2 perfectly normal Adirondack chairs sat untouched. The mustache man hesitated, glancing at his clipboard, then back up at Lucas. "It's unapproved." Lucas fought the urge to smirk. "So let me get this straight. You're trying to arrest me for a mailbox and patio chairs." "This isn't a joke," the mustached man snapped, stepping forward. "Noncompliance with HOA ordinances is a serious matter. You're coming with us." Lucas folded his arms. "And where exactly are you planning to take me?" The man squared his shoulders. "To our holding facility." At that, Lucas couldn't hold back his laughter. "You mean to tell me the HOA has a jail?" The mustache man's face turned red. "It's not a jail. It's a compliance center." Lucas took a slow breath, rubbing his jaw. "I see." He pretended to think it over. "Well, gentlemen, I hate to break it to you, but I'm a little busy today, so I'll have to decline your invitation." The mustache man's patience snapped. "That's it," he barked. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Lucas didn't move. "Or what?" One of the lackeys stepped up, pulling out a cheap pair of handcuffs that looked like they'd break if you sneezed too hard. "Do it now, sir, or we'll be forced to take action." Lucas sighed, shaking his head. "All right." He turned slightly, reaching down to his hip, not for a weapon, but for the small radio clipped to his belt. With a quick press of the button, he sent out a silent distress signal to his deputies, all without breaking eye contact with the so-called officers. The mustache man grinned, clearly thinking he'd won. "That's right," he said smugly. "You're learning your place." Lucas held back another chuckle. "Oh, I know my place." As soon as the lackey stepped forward to slap the flimsy cuffs on him, Lucas moved in a single swift motion. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisted it behind his back, and spun him toward the nearest car. The man yelped as his face smacked against the hood. The mustache man staggered back. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Lucas glanced at him, still holding the struggling man in place. "Performing a citizen's arrest." The second lackey reached for something on his belt, probably a fake citation book or another laminated sheet of nonsense, but he froze as the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Within seconds, real police vehicles skidded to a stop, lights flashing. The HOA officers looked like deer caught in headlights. Lucas leaned in close to the man he had pinned. "Now, let's talk about who's really under arrest." The flashing red and blue lights bounced off the houses as 2 squad cars came to a stop in Lucas's driveway. The mustache man and his 2 lackeys looked like they had just been caught breaking into a bank. Their self-assured posturing vanished the moment Deputy Marcus stepped out of his vehicle, one hand resting on his duty belt. Marcus took in the scene, Lucas still holding one of the fake cops pinned against the hood of a car, and the other two standing frozen in place. He raised an eyebrow. "Boss, you mind telling me why you're wrestling with a guy wearing what looks like a Halloween police costume?" Lucas finally let the squirming man go, stepping back and brushing his hands off. These three gentlemen were in the middle of conducting an unlawful arrest. Figured I'd save them the trouble of doing it the hard way. Marcus let out a low whistle, turning to the trio. "All right, let's see some IDs." The mustached man tried to regain his composure, straightening his cheap polyester uniform. "There's been a misunderstanding. We are authorized HOA enforcement officers, and we were carrying out our duties." Marcus stared at him for a moment, then slowly reached out and plucked the man's shiny badge from his chest. He turned it over in his hands, examining the poorly engraved letters that read HOA Compliance Officer. He looked back up at Lucas. "This is a joke, right?" Lucas smirked. "I wish." The mustache man puffed up his chest again. "We have full legal authority to issue citations and enforce community standards." Marcus remained unimpressed. "Yeah? And which department issued these fancy badges?" The man faltered. "The Homeowners Association Security Division." Marcus snorted. "That's not a thing." The second lackey, still rubbing his wrist from Lucas's takedown, jumped in. "It is. We were given jurisdiction over all properties in this neighborhood." Marcus tilted his head. "Jurisdiction, is that right?" He turned to Lucas. "Boss, did you sign off on that?" Lucas smiled. "Nope." Marcus gave the mustached man a long look. "Well, then, I guess you're just some guys running around playing dress-up." The mustache man's face darkened. "You don't understand. We were only enforcing compliance. We have every right to detain rule breakers." Lucas stepped closer. "Detain? You were trying to arrest me over a mailbox." The mustached man hesitated, clearly realizing how ridiculous it sounded. "Well, technically, eh?" Lucas's voice turned steel-cold. "There's no technically about it. You tried to put cuffs on me. That's impersonating law enforcement. And depending on how you plan to detain me, we could be talking about unlawful restraint, or worse." Marcus folded his arms. "So let's start with some real names and real IDs." The three men hesitated before reluctantly handing over their wallets. Marcus flipped through them, then gave Lucas a look. "You're going to love this. Not a single one of them is a registered security guard. They don't even have basic certifications." Lucas sighed. "You telling me they're not even rent-a-cops?" Marcus shook his head. "Nope. Just some guys in cheap uniforms playing sheriff." The mustache man shifted uncomfortably. "Look, we were just following orders." Lucas narrowed his eyes. "Whose orders?" The man hesitated. "The HOA board." Lucas crossed his arms. "Got any paperwork to prove that?" The second lackey quickly reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled document, handing it over. Marcus took one look and scoffed. "This isn't a contract. It's a volunteer neighborhood watch form." Lucas glanced over it, shaking his head. "So let me get this straight. You three decided that meant you could run around pretending to be cops and extorting homeowners." The mustached man's lips pressed into a thin line. It wasn't extortion. It was community enforcement. Lucas gave him a hard stare. "How much were you charging people for these violations?" The lackeys exchanged nervous glances, but no one spoke. Lucas exhaled through his nose. "Deputy, let's check their vehicle." Marcus nodded and walked over to the HOA-branded SUV parked by the curb. He pulled open the door, rifling through the contents. A moment later, he let out a low whistle. Well. We've got ticket books, fine notices, and, would you look at that, a cash box." Lucas turned to the mustache man. "You running an HOA or a roadside scam?" The man swallowed hard. "We were just collecting fees." Lucas shook his head. "No, what you were doing was fraud." The second lackey blurted out. "We were told to do it. The board promised us a cut." Lucas exchanged a glance with Marcus. "Now we're getting somewhere." Marcus flipped through a ledger he had pulled from the SUV. "They've been hitting the whole neighborhood. Fake fines, intimidation tactics, even threats of foreclosure." Lucas let out a slow sigh. "And people actually paid them?" Marcus nodded. "Looks like it." Lucas turned back to the three men. "So here's what's going to happen. You're all being detained while we investigate. If you're lucky, you'll you'll just be looking at fraud charges. If we find out you threatened or coerced anyone into paying, it's going to get a whole lot worse. The mustache man tried to protest. You can't arrest us for enforcing community rules. Lucas gave him a dry look. Watch me. Marcus stepped forward, pulling out a set of real handcuffs. All right, boys, turn around. The mustache man opened his mouth to argue, but when Marcus raised an eyebrow, he slowly complied. The two lackeys followed, both looking thoroughly defeated as Marcus cuffed them and started reading them their rights. Lucas turned to look at the small crowd of neighbors that had gathered to watch. Some were whispering to each other, others shaking their heads. An older woman near the front of the crowd called out, Sheriff, does this mean we can ignore those fines they've been giving us? Lucas gave her a reassuring nod. If they ever made you pay, keep your receipts. The county prosecutor is going to want to see them. A murmur spread through the crowd, and more people stepped forward, each with their own horror story about how the fake HOA police had bullied them. Lucas looked back at Marcus. We need to have a chat with the HOA board. Marcus grinned. Oh, I can't wait for that. By the time Lucas and his deputies arrived at the HOA office, word had already spread. The board members were waiting for him, looking nervous but determined to put on a good show. The president of the HOA, a thin man in a suit that seemed one size too big, stood in front of the others with his hands clasped in what he probably thought was a dignified pose. Sheriff, the man said with a forced smile, this is all a misunderstanding. Lucas crossed his arms. A misunderstanding? You mean the part where your so-called officers tried to arrest me? Or the part where they were running a fine collection racket? The president cleared his throat. We were simply trying to maintain order in the community. There have been complaints. Lucas cocked his head. Complaints about what exactly? The president hesitated, then gestured vaguely. Non-compliance. Lucas smirked. You mean mailboxes and patio chairs? A woman with short silver hair, another board member, spoke up. Sheriff, we have to enforce neighborhood standards. People buy homes here because they expect a certain level of decorum. Lucas eyed her. And does decorum include hiring unqualified thugs to shake down homeowners? The silver-haired woman stiffened. They were simply volunteers. Lucas pulled out the fake citation book from the so-called HOA police. Volunteers who were charging fines, threatening arrests, and pocketing cash? That's not volunteer work. That's fraud. The board members shifted uncomfortably. The president tried to salvage the situation. Look, maybe we got a little overzealous, but surely we can handle this internally. There's no need to involve law enforcement. Lucas let out a low chuckle. Too late for that. Your boys are already in cuffs, and we've got plenty of evidence. If I were you, I'd start thinking about a lawyer. The president's smile faltered. Surely there's a way to resolve this amicably. Lucas took a step closer. You want amicable? Start by refunding every single dollar these guys took from homeowners. Then we'll talk about what happens next. The silver-haired woman sniffed. This is outrageous. The HOA has operated this way for years. Lucas gave her a hard look. Yeah, well, that ends today. By the time Lucas walked out of the HOA office, the board members looked like they had just been handed a death sentence. He knew they weren't going to get away with this, not if he had anything to say about it. Back in the neighborhood, the scene had turned into something of a block party. People were out on their lawns, chatting animatedly, swapping stories about their own encounters with the fake cops. Some were laughing, others were fuming. An older man in a golf cap approached Lucas. Sheriff, I got fined $200 last month for excessive yard decorations. He gestured to his modestly decorated lawn, which had nothing more than a bird feeder and a small garden gnome. A younger woman stepped up next. They charged me $300 for parking my car in my own driveway overnight. Another neighbor groaned. I had to pay $500 because my grass was an inch too high, and they threatened to double it if I didn't cut it within 24 hours. Lucas shook his head. Y'all are getting your money back, one way or another. The crowd erupted in cheers. Someone even popped open a beer and handed it to Lucas, who accepted it with a grin. Deputy Marcus wandered over, looking amused. This might be the first time I've seen a sheriff's investigation turn into a community festival. Lucas took a sip of his beer. People love seeing justice served. Marcus smirked. Well, you're about to love this. Just got word from the prosecutor's office. They're looking into felony fraud charges against the whole HOA board. Lucas raised an eyebrow. Now that's music to my ears. Marcus held up a file. Oh, and it gets better. We checked the HOA's financial records. Guess who's been skimming money off the top? Lucas leaned in. Don't tell me. Marcus grinned. Your buddy in the cheap suit. The HOA president's been pocketing thousands, and guess where a chunk of that money was going? Right into those fake cops' pockets. Lucas let out a low whistle. Well, looks like we're going to be making another set of arrests. It didn't take long. Within hours, the HOA president and his accomplices were being hauled into squad cars, looking every bit as stunned as the fake cops had been. The neighborhood residents gathered to watch, some even clapping as the handcuffs clicked into place. As Lucas leaned against his truck, watching the last of the arrests, the older man in the golf cap wandered back over. Sheriff, you ever thought about running for mayor? Lucas laughed. I think I'll stick to law enforcement. The man winked. Well, if you change your mind, you got my vote. Lucas just shook his head with a chuckle. Let's just get this neighborhood back to normal first. Part 2. The Aftermath. The days following the arrest of the HOA board and their fake enforcement unit were anything but quiet. The small town of Willow Creek, where Lucas Morgan served as sheriff, was abuzz with chatter. News of the scandal spread like wildfire, and the once quiet neighborhood was now the center of attention. Reporters from nearby towns and even a few from the city had descended upon Willow Creek, eager to get the scoop on the HOA corruption scandal. Lucas, however, had little time to bask in the newfound fame. His desk was piled high with paperwork, witness statements, and financial records from the HOA. The prosecutor's office was working overtime to build a case against the board members, and Lucas was determined to make sure no stone was left unturned. The investigation deepens. Deputy Marcus walked into Lucas's office one morning, holding a thick folder. Boss, you're not going to believe this, he said, dropping the folder on Lucas's desk. We've been going through the HOA's financial records, and it's worse than we thought. Lucas leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. How much worse? Marcus flipped open the folder. Turns out, the HOA president, Mr. Harold Jenkins, wasn't just skimming money from the fines. He's been embezzling funds for years. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. And it's not just him. Other board members were in on it too. They were using HOA funds to pay for personal vacations, luxury cars, even a boat. Lucas let out a low whistle. A boat? What the hell does an HOA need a boat for? Marcus smirked. Exactly. And get this, they were also taking kickbacks from contractors. Anytime the neighborhood needed repairs or maintenance, they'd hire the same company, which just so happened to be owned by Harold's brother-in-law. The prices were inflated, and the work was shoddy. Homeowners were paying through the nose for it. Lucas shook his head in disbelief. This just keeps getting uglier. What about the fake cops? Any more on them? Marcus nodded. Yeah. Turns out, they weren't just volunteers. Harold had been paying them under the table to intimidate homeowners. They were making a tidy profit off those fake fines. And here's the kicker. They were also keeping tabs on anyone who complained about the HOA. If someone spoke out, they'd get hit with even more fines or threats. Lucas leaned forward, his expression grim. This is more than just fraud. This is organized intimidation. We need to make sure the prosecutor knows this wasn't just about money. These people were running a protection racket. The neighborhood fights back. Meanwhile, the residents of Willow Creek were not sitting idly by. Emboldened by Lucas's actions, they had formed a neighborhood coalition to demand accountability from the HOA. Meetings were held in living rooms and backyards, with homeowners sharing their stories and planning their next steps. One evening, Lucas was invited to speak at one of these gatherings. The host, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Thompson, had set up chairs in her backyard, and nearly every homeowner in the neighborhood had shown up. When Lucas arrived, he was greeted with applause and cheers. Sheriff Morgan, Mrs. Thompson said, stepping forward to shake his hand. We can't thank you enough for what you've done. You've given us our neighborhood back. Lucas smiled modestly. I just did my job. But this isn't over yet. We need to make sure something like this never happens again. The crowd murmured in agreement. A man in the back raised his hand. Sheriff, what can we do to help? We want to make sure those crooks get what's coming to them. Lucas nodded. First, if you've paid any fines to the HOA in the past year, bring your receipts to the station. We're building a case to get your money back. Second, if you've had any interactions with the so-called enforcement unit, we need your statements. The more evidence we have, the stronger our case will be. A woman near the front spoke up. What about the HOA itself? Do we even need it? They've done nothing but cause trouble. Lucas considered the question. That's up to you. An HOA can be a good thing if it's run properly. But if you decide to keep it, you'll need to elect new board members, people you can trust. And you'll need to set clear rules to prevent this kind of abuse from happening again. The crowd erupted into discussion, with some advocating for disbanding the HOA altogether and others pushing for reform. Lucas stayed for a while, answering questions and offering advice, before finally heading back to the station. A new threat emerges. Just when Lucas thought things were starting to settle down, a new problem arose. A few days after the neighborhood meeting, Deputy Marcus burst into his office, looking concerned. "Boss, we've got a situation," Marcus said. "Someone's been vandalizing homes in the neighborhood. Broken windows, slashed tires, even a few spray-painted threats." Lucas frowned. "Any idea who's behind it?" Marcus shook his head. "Not yet. But it's happening to people who've been vocal about the HOA scandal. Looks like someone's trying to intimidate them." Lucas's jaw tightened. "This isn't over. Whoever's behind this, they're trying to scare people into silence. We need to put a stop to it, fast." That night, Lucas and Marcus set up a stakeout near one of the homes that had been targeted. They parked a few houses down, keeping a close watch on the quiet street. Hours passed with no sign of activity, and just as they were about to call it a night, a shadowy figure appeared, carrying a can of spray paint. Lucas and Marcus moved quickly, intercepting the vandal before he could do any damage. After a brief struggle, they had him in cuffs. When they pulled off his mask, they were surprised to see a young man in his early 20s, someone Lucas recognized as Harold Jenkins's nephew. "What's your name, son?" Lucas asked, shining a flashlight in the young man's face. The man hesitated before muttering, "Ethan. Ethan Jenkins." Lucas exchanged a glance with Marcus. "Jenkins, huh? Any relation to Harold?" Ethan looked down, avoiding eye contact. "He's my uncle." Lucas sighed. "Looks like the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. You're under arrest, Ethan. Let's see if your uncle's willing to bail you out." The fallout. The arrest of Ethan Jenkins was the final nail in the coffin for the HOA board. With evidence of embezzlement, fraud, and now intimidation, the prosecutor had more than enough to bring charges against Harold Jenkins and his accomplices. The trial was swift, and the verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. As for the neighborhood, the residents voted to disband the HOA and start fresh. A new community association was formed, with Mrs. Thompson elected as its first president. The rules were clear, transparent, and designed to protect homeowners rather than exploit them. Lucas, meanwhile, became something of a local hero. The story of how he took down the corrupt HOA spread far and wide, and he was even invited to speak at a statewide law enforcement conference about community policing and accountability. But for Lucas, the real reward was seeing the neighborhood come together. The block parties continued, and the sense of community grew stronger than ever. As he stood in Mrs. Thompson's backyard one evening, watching the neighbors laugh and chat, he couldn't help but smile. "You did good, Sheriff," Mrs. Thompson said, handing him a plate of food. "We're lucky to have you." Lucas shook his head. "No, ma'am. I'm lucky to serve a community like this." And with that, he took a bite of his barbecue, content in the knowledge that justice had been served and that Willow Creek was finally back on track. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.